What's up guys, Chris Brandt here, and today I'm going to be walking you through a step-by-step installation of your brand new QSE Fox kit on a Polaris Matrix snowmobile. All right guys, before we get started, I wanted to lay out the contents of the QSE kit and then show you the required tools. This is basically all we're going to need to be able to install QSE on our rear suspension kit. First, I'm going to remove the stock skid from the snowmobile, and I'm going to remove the shocks from that rear skid. Also, I'm going to take off the left-hand side panel or clutch side panel, and that will give us room to install our wiring harness. So now that we've got our skid removed, our stock shocks removed, and the left-hand side panel, we can move on to the next step of putting our shocks on the rear skid. And a little pro tip guys, for the front track shock, the lower bolts that go through the rail, when you take those out, don't take the bolt all the way out. What you want to do is run that bolt in and out just a couple times to break up that Loctite before you take each bolt all the way out. That eliminates the shaft from spinning and will eliminate a headache for you later down the road. Okay, first I'm going to start with the install of the rear track shock. So what I want you guys to note here is the orientation of the actual shock. So basically it's going to go with the reservoir and the live valve here on the exhaust side of the snowmobile towards the front part of the rear suspension. So I'm going to put that in first. And then next I'm going to follow up with the mount on the rear torque arm. Okay, I've got the rear track shock here mounted, oriented correctly, and now I'm just going to tighten the two bolts, and then we're going to move on to the front track shock. Now it's time to install the front track shock. And so one thing to note is when you remove the factory front track shock and the front track shock shaft assembly, you want to take note of the orientation of the bushings and the washers, okay? And so what I like to do when I have it all assembled and I'm ready to put it into the new Fox front track shock is I'll basically take all of the bushings, the wheel, another bushing, wave washer, and washer, and I'll kind of just pull that off all at once. Then I can just run the shaft through the shock, and then I can put all of the whole assembly back on the shaft in the correct order. And voila, now I'm ready to install the full assembly with the front track shock into the rear skid. All right, a couple things to note when you're installing the front track shock is the orientation of the reservoir. So we're going to be on the same side as our rear track shock, so on the exhaust side, and it's going to be with the reservoir up, okay? So as we go in, there's two other things that I want you to note is that when we install the lower track shock shaft, there's these two washers that are spaced in between the shaft and the rail, one on each side, so don't forget those. And then also, when you remove your OEM shock, you don't necessarily need to take the limiter strap off. However, it makes it a ton easier putting the front track shock back in when you remove one of the bolts on the limiter strap. Also, one thing you're going to want to do on that front track shock lower shaft, the two bolts, you're going to apply just a dab of red Loctite to this. This is the only place that you're going to use Loctite on this install, but that's a little pro tip that you'll want to take with you. All right guys, as I mentioned, it is a lot easier to put this bolt in with the limiter strap off. You can see I don't have to compress the shock or do anything goofy like that. So I'm going to put the bolt in here, get these, the top bolt tightened, the two bottom bolts tightened, and then we'll move on to reinstalling our limiter strap. All right, now that I've got my front track shock installed, I'm going to remove the skid off of the table, put it on the ground so I can push down on that front torque arm to reinstall the limiter strap. Collapses the shock. I can route the limiter strap back up on the torque arm here. and then install my bolt. So our final step before we install the wire harness on the QSE rear track shock is we need to flip the shock rod bolt so that the head of the bolt is on the same side as the reservoir of the QSE shock. That will provide you additional clearance for the QSE harness. Now, the awesome part about QSE, we have one single wire that we're going to be routing from the rear track shock up the front torque arm and through the tunnel of the snowmobile. Okay, so now that we have our wire, what we're going to do is we're going to first, there's a Christmas tree clip on the harness that we're going to put into the bottom of the shock first. Here you can see the threaded hole in the bottom of the cap where the Christmas tree clip goes for the harness. All right, once again, we started with the Christmas tree clip going into the bottom of the body cap. Now, what that does is that basically orientates the harness exactly where it needs to be for our install. So now I'm going to clip in the connector to the QSE, and now we're going to route the harness on the outside of the torque arm. All right, now we're gonna install the wire guard. And one thing to note here is there's a channel here on the guard where the wire fits in. And so that channel will be on the outside of the torque arm, and it will have the riv nuts on the bottom. Okay, so let's go ahead and route our wire. So again, we go on the outside of the torque arm, underneath the shock, on the top of the torque arm, and then through the track guide hole here. So we basically have our harness loosely in place there. Now we can put the wire guard over the torque arm with the wire harness inside the channel guard here. Okay, so a little finagling getting the wire into underneath the guard, but just remember, you're going to run it into the channel of the guard, and then on the top and the bottom of the wire harness, there's some heat shrink material that you're going to notice. That's when you know you kind of have the harness in the right spot. Once we have it in the right spot, then we're going to basically squeeze the guard together, and then we're gonna start our bolts that, again, you gotta remember there's 3 little washers with those bolts, one for each bolt, so 1 washer and 1 bolt. And then I'm gonna start and put that in and kind of go loosely, starting that first one there. Get that started. And then I'll grab my second one. This allows me the ability to move and adjust it, just making sure it's in its proper spot. Once I get these 3 bolts in place, I'm gonna tighten that down, and then we'll finish with zip tying the harness to the front of the torque arm. All right, now that we have our guard in place, we're going to finish up the harness install by putting our 3 zip ties in. The zip tie location is indicated by the white tape. And just again, remember the harness goes above the torque arm, below the shock, above the torque arm, and then through the track guide. And then finish it up with the last zip tie here. Okay, now we'll clip these zip ties, and now we're ready to install our skid back into the snowmobile. All right, guys, well, we're about halfway done with our install, and now it's time to address where the wire is going to come through the tunnel. And so what I like to use is a metal ruler. If you just have a tape measure, you can make that work as well. So just remember these measurements, okay? We're going to be 1 inch up from the center line of the bolt, and we're going to be 1 3/8 left of the center bolt, and that's where we're going to mark our point, where we're going to use a center punch, and we're going to drill our hole, okay? Now, one thing to remember is the hole location on the 2025 and 2026 matrices is different than the 2022 and 24. We'll reference that in the video with the numbers. Center line of the bolt, 1 inch mark. And then what we're going to do, we're going to come here on our mark, and we're going to be 1 3/8. All right, so we just drilled our 7/8 hole. Now an important part of this process is we want to deburr the hole. The grommet is a pretty tight fit, so you can either use your unibit to kind of chamfer those edges to get any burrs off, or you can use a deburring tool, and then we'll install our grommet. Okay, now it's time to throw our rear suspension back in the sled. I like to do it with the sled on its side. This would be also a great time to call a friend. It is a lot easier to put the skid frame in with 2 people. One thing to note here is when you throw the rear suspension back into the chassis here is be mindful of the wire, obviously. I kind of tuck mine up behind the limiter strap or behind the front track shock there just to keep it out of the way while I'm going in. I'm going to put my 4 bolts in and then I will run the wire through the grommet that we just installed. Okay, got the skid frame back installed. Now I'm going to reach up under the chassis here, grab the wiring harness, and then run it through our grommet. You guys want to be careful when you're pulling this through, not to pull too hard or at a different angle, or it'll pull the grommet through. So now we're through the tunnel. Now we're going to move on to the next step of putting the cover plate on, and then also removing our shroud to gain access to where we'll be routing the wiring. Okay. So here I loosened the bolt so I can put in our cover plate here. Wire is going to come up here. Slip this behind the washer. And just like that, that will be where it needs to be. Okay. Our kick plate's installed, our wires coming through the grommet. Now we're gonna move on to finishing the routing and gaining access to where the rest of the harness will be located. Okay, we got our wire coming through the tunnel. We've got the kick plate installed. Now we're going to finish prepping the vehicle to finish the install. So we got one T40 here. You've got your clutch belt tool here. And what I like to do, if you just grab your spare belt out of your spare belt holder and hold this up on the handlebar here, this makes it nice to hold this console up out of the way so we can get to the wire here. Okay, also I've got handlebar bags here. I'm gonna remove these. That gains us access to where we're gonna run our switch, and then we'll run the wire down through here connecting to the harness. All right guys, well, we've got our harness here, and so what I like to do to start with is I'm going to grab the wire that plugs into the switch. I'm going to fish that up here on top of the black accessory bag here. I'm gonna route it up to the handlebar. That's where I'm gonna come in. I'm going to plug in my switch, push that wire back down, mount the switch to the handlebar, and then we'll finish up mounting the resistor and the accessory plug after we dial in the switch on the handlebar. Okay, we're gonna mount the switch now, and of course, switch location is personal preference, but one thing I like to just keep in mind is I want something that's easy to get to while I'm riding or on the fly. So pretty simple, just two little screws here. I'm gonna mount the switch basically so it's underneath here. You do have to be a little mindful of the handlebar warmer, your hand warmer wire is under there. You don't want to pinch that in your clamp. So basically I'm going to put this on loosely. Got that on there now. I'm going to route the wire on the back side. On your 2025 and 26s, you have these little rubber straps that basically take the place of zip ties. I'm going to take those two off. I'm going to run my wire underneath those, and then I'm going to connect it to the wire that I fished up to the top, and then I'm going to end up pulling that back down, and I'll zip tie the slack underneath when I pull this back down from above the clutch cover. Couple things to note here. When you put the switch on, you need to be mindful of your hand warmer wire. Don't get that caught in the actual bracket for the switch. And then when you put your two screws on, you're going to tighten up the back first, and then orientate the switch where you want it, and then you'll tighten the screw closest to the rider. And then you'll also want to note running the wire down here, and then we've got these little rubber tabs that replace zip ties on the 25 and 26s. We'll go ahead and put those on. And then we'll plug in the wire, pull our wire down here, zip tie the slack in the bottom above the clutch cover. All right, just a couple last few steps. So we're going to locate our accessory plug on the vehicle in this black bag. So you'll locate a plug that will have a cap on it that says accessory. That's where you're going to plug in. Or there's also an accessory plug up by the headlight as well. So you can use either one. On this particular vehicle, we're going to use the one in the black bag, easy to get to. Once we plug in the accessory plug, then we're going to take one of the 10mm nuts off of the clutch cover here, and we're going to mount our resistor bracket onto the clutch cover, and then put the bolt on, and then finish up a couple zip ties to the overstructure, make it nice and tidy, and that's it. We are done. So I am installing this on a boost, so the routing will be slightly different on an NA model because you have the intake plenum right here. But normally on a naturally aspirated sled, we'll do all the wiring on the back side of the intake plenum. But yeah, I'll secure it up here. We'll cut some zip ties and put our console back together, and we are ready to roll. All right, so our install is wrapped up. This is the time that I take to double check all of my routing, double check my zip tie location, make sure everything is put back together that I took apart, and now the fun part, and that's testing QSE. So now, because I'm in the shop and I'm shooting with the camera, I'm not going to start my sled. I actually have my accessory side of the snowmobile plugged into 12 volts. So that's going to light up my switch, which it does right here, as you can see. Okay, so when the switch is lit, that means we are in have fun mode, okay? It's where our suspension is in drive mode, makes the front end feel light, wheelie, all that fun stuff, okay? Look what happens when in regular drive mode. The snowmobile and suspension moves a bunch, okay? Now, to take advantage of all your buddies who didn't buy QSE, as you're riding and you see the hill and you want to go get them stuck, you switch the switch to up or the light goes off. Now look what the rear suspension does. Okay, it gets really stiff. It gets really stiff because it keeps the front end on the ground and us propelling our snowmobile up to the top where you high five yourself at the top because you're the only one with QSE until your buddies see how cool it is and then they get it and then you can have a party at the top. And I can't thank you guys enough for the purchase of QSE, and I hope you guys have a blast out on the mountain just like I do with this awesome new technology from Fox.